The most important part of screeding and laying the driveway blocks is to top up the subbase to get the correct levels for the sand. So often aggregates are pre-ordered and sand arrives too early, and when it's not enough, it's topped up with more and more sand. This is unfortunate as MOT costs the same as sand and it would require the same amount of volume to reach the level, so it's just poor planning. Here, the edging blocks are laid on 60mm of mortar and the infill blocks will be laid on 25mm of sand. So calculating the difference, this project needs an extra 4 tons of loose MOT to bring up to the correct levels. The MOT is then spread, raising up the level to almost the bottom of the edging blocks. It's really important with this final layer to be mixing in the MOT, making sure it's a good blend of small and large fines, so it compacts securely and evenly. A string line is then set up and tensioned across the driveway to give reference to the finished level. This is used to go along and measure the depth and make sure the levels are consistent. The string line is then moved across the driveway in increments to check the levels all over the whole area. The final layer is then whacked up and down in a crosshatch pattern to give a good even solid subbase. It's given a good final soaking down before the final few whacks, making sure there's no more it can be compact. The result is the edging blocks sitting 25mm proud of the subbase. And the reason for this is the screeding rails, which are 25mm in diameter, are going to dictate the level of the sand and give the finished height of the new driveway. And there's no reason for this sand to be anything above 25mm anywhere on the project. And anything too thick, over about 40mm, could become a significant structural weakness in the driveway, especially with these compound jointed blocks. The sharp sand sourced for this project is extremely coarse and has very high grit content. It's then spread over the whole area and brushed out to an even flat surface. It's dampened down slightly as moisture is a key factor in improving the compaction and workability of sand. The area can then be whacked and have at least 2 passes with the whacker plate to give a compact layer just proud of the finished level. The screeding bar is then set up to dictate the width of the first section to be screeded. The rails are laid out and then the corner of the shovel is used to open up the sand, leaving a groove. A round nose trowel is then used along the rail to make the perfect size channel all the way down to the MOT. The screeding rails are then positioned in the grooves, sitting them flat on the MOT. A string line is then tensioned over the top to set the finished height of the driveway. A block is then used as a guide to go along and tweak the height of the rails. To gauge the depth, the aim is to sit 5mm proud of the string line. This is how much the blocks will compact down at the end of the project. Once the rails are set, they are packed all the way around with sand, going along smoothing over with a float, so they are completely covered and the levels are once again higher than needed. To remove the excess, the screeding bar takes off a layer of sand using the screeding rail on one side and the edging blocks on the other side. These dictate the finished level of the sand bed. As the excess builds up, it's removed with the shovel, and this is continued all the way down the driveway. Once the first area is screeded, the laying can be started off in the perpendicular corner and laying to the width of the screeded area. As soon as they are positioned, the blocks can be walked on and laid all the way up the screeded area. The next section is then prepped, once again the area whacked with at least 2 passes with a whacker plate. The rails are then set in the sand using exactly the same technique, with the screeding bar setting the width. Again, a corner of the shovel is run all the way down the rail to open up the sand, and then a round nose trowel is used to get down to the MOT. Rails are sunk in place, a tension string line is set up to set the depth of the rail using a block to gauge the height, and then the sand is then packed all the way over the rails, leaving the levels proud. The screeding bar is used again, only this time it's guided by both rails on either side. As soon as this section is screeded, the first set of rails that were installed are now redundant and can be removed. They are carefully lifted out of the sand and the channel left behind can be filled and compact heavily with a float, making sure it's as firm and smooth as the rest of the sand around it. This section of the driveway can now be installed in exactly the same technique as before. The pattern being followed is a completely random laying technique, however it does follow a very strict formula to keep it uniform. First thing is not to add too many blocks of the same size, so it's a nice consistent mix of blocks. More importantly, all the blocks are staggered. So for example, if the corners of 4 blocks were to be laid together to create a cross joint, this joint and the pattern would immediately draw your eye to it and stand out amongst the finished driveway. Instead, different sized blocks would be used to give a nice evenly staggered joints for each row, making sure nothing stands out and giving a nice consistent random pattern throughout. For the last section of the screeding, a shorter screeding bar is used and worked down as before, using the driveway edgings as a guide on this side. As the arc approaches and the bar runs out of edgings to use as a guide, another rail is added. This section can then be continued all the way down to the bottom of the driveway. This new rail and the edgings can then be used to start the screeding out around this curve as much as possible. And when it gets to a point where it runs out of edging, quite simply, another rail is added. And this gets another section done all the way down to the bottom of the driveway. And this technique of adding as many rails for as many level changes or difficult areas to screed over would be continued. It would just be a case of adding more and more rails until the path is reached. In this case, it doesn't need rails as the edging blocks are close enough together to be used as a guide. The technique here is to cut a piece of wood down to use as a jig and set the level of the sand. Once screeded, every single whole block that can fit can be laid, and the only ones left now are the ones that need cutting in. For the cuts, a block is overlaid by eye using a white chalk to mark them. Again, all cuts are done with dust masks, eye protection, ear defenders, and water suppression to minimise any risk of polluting the air. The blocks are clamped to keep feet away from the blade. Once all the edging cuts are done, it's just the recessed manhole covers that need cutting in. A method for cutting in these is to use a straight edge to mark the outer blocks. If the straight edge is covering the features of the manhole, the chalk lines being marked are the exact cut lines. The spaces are then packed out so the blocks can be laid on one level. The pattern laid out tweaking each one so they're exact. Then something with a right angle, like these engineering bricks, is used. When the engineers cover the chalk lines, the straight edge against them plumbs up the exact lines to be marked. So then it's just a case of checking each one by eye, cutting each one, and then infilling. Now at this stage, if the driveway was a kiln-dried, sand-jointed project, then quite simply, KD sand is brushed into all the joints. The whole area of the driveway is then whacked 3 or 4 times with a whacker plate. Then the sand would just need topping up, and that would be the end of the project. However, for this compound jointed driveway, the first thing to do is go around and replace any rogue blocks that aren't sitting evenly. A protection mat is then used on the whacker plate to prevent scratching on the premium blocks, and then the whole area whacked repeatedly in the crosshatch pattern. Once fully compact, they're ready for the jointing compound. The next thing to do is jet wash the whole area because resin and dust are a really bad combination. Once clean and had time to dry, all the blocks are moistened down with water. The compound is applied in bulk and slowly brushed backwards, allowing it to sink into the joints before being worked over the whole driveway. The joints are then struck off with a jointing iron before being topped back up with extra compound to increase the density and prevent sinking. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, always follow the product's most recent installation guidelines and not videos on YouTube. If unsure or need advice, contact the manufacturer's technical support team. They're there to help, and a correct installation will ensure you maintain the product's warranty. Good luck.